TopMedTalk.
Well, hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm Desiree Chappell, your host. And today we're going to be diving into a topic that here on TopMedTalk, we are truly committed to and discuss quite often here, patient safety in anesthesia and perioperative medicine. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Sven Stander. He is a leading anesthesiologist and dedicated advocate for advancing safety standards in our world of perioperative medicine. His work has driven major improvements in patient care across Europe and way beyond. We're really excited to hear his insights and explore how each one of us can make anesthesia and perioperative medicine safer for every single patient that we take care of. So Sven, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Sven, where are you joining us from?
I'm living in Switzerland and my home office is in Zurich in Switzerland.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your research interests?
Well, I'm an anesthesiologist and an intensive care physician. But when I started training for anesthesiology in the University of Basel, where I had my formal training, I had the privilege to work in a fantastic team with brilliant people, and my head of the department infected me with the idea of quality and safety. And actually, he was very influential, not only for me. He spent a lot of departmental money developing the first full-scale simulator in the operating room. And very early had a close cooperation with NASA, with Bob Helmreich. When I happened to meet Bob Helmreich in the 1990s or so, all of a sudden he talked to me and he said, well, Sven, you know, in aviation, we have this incident reporting. Have you ever considered about incident reporting in anesthesiology? That was the beginning of the idea to deal with incident reporting. I've been since then infected by the idea of patient safety, team working, simulation, looking for errors, and all this stuff.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the major patient safety issues that we're facing that it's kind of completely different than what you worked back in the 90s on?
An idea of a colleague of mine, he once said to me, Sven, listen, we have fantastic medications. We have a lot of very fancy monitoring devices and technical equipment in anesthesiology. But the lacking part in our business is the human factor. Surely we must concentrate on new devices. We must concentrate on new drugs. But the big advantage and the big investments in the future when it comes to improving safety and quality will come from the human aspect and not from the pharmaceutical industries. That was also a very influential part of my education. So sorry, guys from the pharmaceuticals. I very much admire what you're doing. But honestly, the major advantages, I think, have been in the last 10 to 20 years. And since then, I think we must concentrate on the human aspect.
When we talk about human factors, what are some of those big issues? I mean, we've had multiple conversations on TopMedTalk, especially when we are talking about technology and limitations. But what do you see are some of those major things?
There are a couple of aspects. First of all, starting by ourselves, we must be aware that we have quite some challenges when it comes to our personal performance. We have performance limitations. Think about fatigue issues, think about stress issues. They heavily influence the way we are working and the way we are interacting with our teams. That brings me to the next aspect of the human performance part. Teamwork and coordination in the team is absolutely crucial in the operating room. When I started my training back in the last century, we had the issue that we had very rude communication issues in the operating room at these days. There was a little improvement over the last decades, but when I'm looking at the average work in a dense and stressed operating room, I think there is still a lot of room for improvement in coordination and communication issues inside the anesthesia team, but also with our partners from the operating room, with the surgeons, the nurses, and so on.
And especially in very tense environments where we're taking care of high-risk patients for high-risk surgeries, it becomes an obstacle for communication, and things can get quite toxic at times whenever we're all under major stress. So you have done so much work in this space. You've worked on the Helsinki Declaration on Patient Safety, you had mentioned critical incident reporting systems, and really leading the European Patient Safety Foundation. So how have you worked through these different documents and relationships and foundations that you feel like you are really pushing the human factor side?
Well, I think it is a kind of evolution. When I started developing the international incident reporting system, I was influenced by people like David Garber, for example, or Jeff Cooper from Boston West General Hospital. At the beginning, there were a few people that were enthusiasts of safety. And I very much remember it was the second Annenberg symposium back in the 1987 or so, where I was invited as an international speaker reporting on incident reporting. So you see, it's already a really, really long time ago. But in these days, there were only just enthusiasts talking about safety and quality issues. A lot of people were dealing with all the other important aspects of technology and pharmacology, and so in anesthesiology. When I first tried to publish incident reporting in the journal Anesthesiology, I had a very nice conversation with the then editor-in-chief of Anesthesiology, and he said, it's interesting, but we cannot publish because this is not quantitative data. We cannot publish because you don't have a comparing group, you don't have a blinding of your cases also. It's not the time to publish data on incident reporting back in the 90s. And then when we started dealing in the European Society of Anesthesiology with safety, again, we were a couple of European enthusiasts that were dealing with safety. And this evolved over the years. The people were more attracted. The audience was getting bigger in our international conferences for the European Society. And the network was spreading and was getting bigger. And I think, as you mentioned, the biggest step forward internationally, I think, was really the development of the Helsinki Declaration on Safety in Anesthesiology. Because there, for the first time, we sat together and tried to define a core set of competencies and requirements for safety in anesthesiology. And I very much remember how long it took us in Europe to concentrate and to build up with these competencies. And finally, there was a huge success of this Helsinki Declaration. At the end, we even managed to have China and Japan sign the Helsinki Declaration. And funnily enough, the biggest discussions were with the American Society of Anesthesiology at these days. And not that we did not have a very good cooperation with the American Society of Anesthesiology. And I remember having wonderful conversations with the colleagues from America, Audrey Bando, for example. They were very supportive. But the Americans had the problem that basically it was a European document. And they could only recommend the Helsinki Declaration, but they could not officially sign the Helsinki Declaration.
Yeah. That's so funny. So it's been 15 years since the Helsinki Declaration. Tell us a little bit more about that.
The Helsinki Declaration was influenced by the Intensive Care Society in Europe because they came up with a document on safety in intensive care medicine. And it was Hugo van Aken from Münster in Germany and Jannike Melin Olsen from Norway. They both came to me and said, why don't we have a European document on safety in anesthesiology? Then when we were talking about how the naming of the document shall be, very soon we decided, why not Helsinki Declaration? Because it was to be Helsinki, the next place of the Euro Anesthesia Congress, where the document should be officially launched. Then again, we had some nice discussions about the Declaration of Helsinki, which is an ethical document in medicine, and the Helsinki Declaration. So we had strict people in Europe that said, no, you can't call it the Helsinki Declaration. But we said, it's such an opportunity to be in Helsinki and to have this document signed. Nevertheless, we decided for the Helsinki Declaration. And after that, a lot of work had to be done to distribute the Helsinki Declaration, because writing down the words is one thing, to have an agreement on the content is one thing, but to distribute it and to really make it live in all of the European countries and all over the world, finally, that was and still is a challenge.
Yeah. What would you say is some of the biggest takeaways from that declaration that you had determined or come to consensus on?
The most important aspect was the focus on the human aspect and the cooperation and the non-technical skills in the operating room to really make that integral and important part of our work in the operating room. I think this is the most important thing of the Helsinki Declaration, because we have a lot of guiding information, for a lot of guidelines on the use of pulse oximetry, on the use of neuromuscular devices, airway management, and so on. But a document on the importance of the human factor was lacking, and I think is still a little bit lacking in our societies.
Yeah, I think so too. I would agree. Things like timeouts and ensuring that we're doing those and we're all on the same page and we have the right patient, right surgery, right appendage if we're working, or the correct, I should say, appendage that we're working on. All those have made significant strides and I think improved the communication for our teams, as well as checklists and things that we use.
And that was a timely coincidence with the development in the European society that the WHO was coming up with the safe surgery checklist these days. And I think this was, as I mentioned, an evolution of aspects in our topics of safety from individual societies, as from the European Society of Anesthesiology with this Helsinki Declaration.
So you had mentioned working with our surgical colleagues and other people outside our space of anesthesia and more of that perioperative medicine, perioperative care teams. Tell us a little bit more about some of those relationships and how some of the work that you've done with the Patient Safety Foundation in Europe and the other organizations that you're working with.
All of you working with our surgical colleagues in the operating room know that we are probably coming from a little bit different cultures, working cultures in the background. There is some very interesting work being done by a French scientist, René Amalberti. He's very much dedicated on system safety. A couple of years ago, he published very important work where he could show that in hospitals, we do have a lot of various safety cultures in parallel. For example, the anesthesiology community is coming from the ultra-safe safety culture. And that is pretty clear because we love to compare ourselves with pilots and all these safety guys coming from these ultra-safe organizations. And we love checklists, for example. And on the other hand, we have this so-called resilient safety culture that is focusing on individual capacity. René Amalberti published a very nice paper, and he showed that a lot of surgical disciplines, for example, the obstetricians and the trauma surgeons, a lot of them are coming from a resilient safety culture background, focusing on individual capacity. When you have both of these cultures colliding in the operating room, the ultra-safe anesthesiologists that says we must avoid any risk, and the surgeon who says, I'm capable of doing this, so let's do it. And we very often have a crash of safety cultures. We are both dedicated to have the best outcome for our patients in the operating room, but we are simply coming from a different cultural background when it comes to safety. When I realized that, I understood that this is a trick to deal with it. We must not come with our ultra-safe attitudes as anesthesiologists and say we are the only one who know about safety. That's completely wrong because our surgical colleagues, they have the same dedication to safety, but they have a simply different approach. And an aspect that I realized in my work where we can come together, surgeons and anesthesiologists, and what we both love is to have training together, surgeons and anesthesiologists in the background of aviation. We very early had in Switzerland the opportunity to have training courses with the former Swiss Air, now the Swiss airline, yeah, exactly. And it was easy to invite a senior surgeon to come to a communication course together with pilots on the ground of Swiss Air together with anesthesiologists, because as the role model for us as anesthesiologists, the pilot. So we kind of had a neutral ground where we could cooperate on the topic of communication. And that was really a success story because all of a sudden there was no longer the green barrier between us in the operating room, but we were dealing with the same topic, talking about safety on the ground of aviation. And that was pretty much of a success story. But again, that was not our development. I very much remember that David Garber in Stanford also had a very close relationship with aviation. So I think I'm not sure where this idea originally came from, but I think David Garber also was on this idea of incorporating the different cultures in the background of aviation.
We had a really interesting conversation with Kevin Fong, who is an anesthesiologist and critical care medicine doc and flight doc out of the UK this last year at the World Congress of Anesthesiologists. And he gave, I think it was the Harold Griffith lecture about safety and the culture of safety and how we might be getting it wrong a little bit. And so what he was saying, and I think you alluded to this a bit, is that the culture, and when we compare aviation, we are focusing a little bit more on individual improvement in what we're doing and how we take care of each individual patient rather than, and I think when you talk about communication and more the human factors, it's the broader complex system and infrastructure by which we are working within that really needs to be changed. And that's the lesson that we need to learn from the airlines. It's not that, hey, Desiree Chappell as an anesthesia clinician and professional can do better and I can up my skills, which we all can. It is that the structure and infrastructure around me can help me do my job better. And as we go into this next era of utilizing complex systems, our job's not going to be the same job that we were doing 10 and 15, 20 years ago and beyond. We are going to be operators of computer systems, but still having to keep our, literally checking the pulse at times and looking at our patients. But any thoughts around that?
Oh, yes. I think this is one of the challenges that we are having ahead. And you mentioned complexity. And I think this is exactly an aspect where we as anesthesiologists can learn from the resilient guys, because in anesthesiology, as I mentioned, we love guiding information. We love checklists, but we must be aware that we cannot control the whole world of our daily business and the whole complexity only with guidelines and with standardizing procedures. I remember very well when I gave a lecture at the PGA meeting years ago in New York, I talked about the limitations that we have in too many guidelines in anesthesiology.
That got great feedback.
Yes, and after my lecture in this great lecture hall in New York, Arnold Barry, the famous Arnold Barry, approached me afterwards and introduced himself and said, "Nice to meet you, Sven. I'm Arnold Barry. I'm the chairman of the guidelines committee of the American Society." And I thought by myself, okay, this is the end of my day today in New York. But we had a wonderful conversation afterwards. And I think we must learn in anesthesiology that definitely standardization and guidelines are an important part of our work because they define the groundwork of what we are doing. They define the way we want to do our work. They define, especially for the young colleagues, that they know this is the way we are working. But we must keep the resilience to deal with a situation that is running out of a guideline, that is running out of a standard. When we are having a non-standardized situation, we as anesthesiologists must be able to handle with that situation. And that sometimes requires to breach a guideline or to have a standard that we are not meeting in the night. And this is the very important aspect of resilience, because we must be able to decide when we deviate from a standard, when we breach a standard, when we have a violation of a standard. The tricky thing with these deviation of standards is the outcome matters. Yeah. When the outcome is good, everybody says, well, wow, great, you're the hero of the night. You changed everything and the patient survived. But if the outcome is bad, everybody will say, why did you not stick to the guideline? Why did you just not stick to the standard? And that's the pretty much of a challenge for dealing with complexity. But as you mentioned, complexity is a fact. And we must somehow try to deal with this aspect of how can we train, how can we support our staff in our hospitals to be able to deviate from a standard when it is necessary to do so. And I think this is a very, very critical aspect.
I struggle because I do believe in standardization and guidelines because I do feel that variation is usually the root of is in the variability of outcomes, I guess I should say. I mean, we've shown that time and time again. However, we still need to use our brain. I mean, we all have our clinical acumen and our depth of knowledge and experience. That being said, we can't deviate all the time because we know standardization is best. How do we integrate these ideas around patient safety and quality improvement initiatives where we are trying to standardize, but not dictating per se how we take care of patients?
I think, first of all, we must make sure that we apply all these standards and guidelines. I think they definitely make sense. This is, as I mentioned, this is the way we are working. And there's no need to deviate from a standard when it comes to an elective ASA1 patient in our operating room. And this is work as imagined. And we must work like this and not with a deviation because today it's nice weather outside and I want to intubate a complete different way. No way, no way. So I think we must make it pretty much clear. Standardization is very much an important aspect in our daily business. But again, we have situations where we do not have guiding informations. We have situations where we have to use, as you mentioned, our brains and our capabilities as clinicians to decide that in exactly that particular situation, another approach might be appropriate. And I very much discussed this with working psychologists from other disciplines in Europe. And finally, we came up, because I asked the question, how can the individual anesthesiologist at night, for example, how can he or she be sure that she's on the right track when she decides to deviate from a standard and a guideline? Because as I mentioned, when you are standing before the situation and you do not know the outcome, you are pretty much in a danger zone. And when do you decide? And how can you decide? And who can be able to decide? Definitely the junior resident in anesthesiology should never deviate from a standard and a guideline. But from which level onwards, from which education level onwards, from which seniority onwards are you capable to deviate from a standard? That's a very, very tricky question. And when I discussed this with working psychologists in Europe, we came up with the idea that probably crowd intelligence might be an important aspect. So when I'm working in a team with my colleagues, with anesthesia nurses together, or for example, with other anesthesiologists in the team, I have a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of brain available. And when I say, okay, let's see, colleagues, I have this situation. I think we should deviate now from the standard. Do you agree or do you not agree? Then at least you do have a little bit more brain power, at least 2 or 3 people, when they also say, okay, this situation is so special, so out of the circumstances that the deviation makes sense. I think you are a little bit more on the safe side of deviation. So to make a long story short, I think teamwork and coordination and decision-making in teams is the clue for dealing with complexity.
Yeah, definitely. So how do we get change? How do we manage change? And how do we get our colleagues, whether it be anesthesia, team surgeon, team nursing, I mean, all of it, this is a team sport, as you said. How do we get everybody to start, as we say here, singing from the same page or going in the same direction and adopting some of these principles? What has worked over your career to do that? I heard you say one example is bringing the surgeons in and working with the aviation teams and tried to break down those barriers, the drape that we have in the OR. What are some other things that have worked for you?
Not much. That's the problem.
I'm glad you're honest and candid about that, Sven.
Unfortunately, I must say so, because the whole aspect of patient safety, from my point of view, is kind of in a crisis state today. There's a wonderful book, Still Not Safe, that has been published a couple of years ago. Bob Weirs and Kathleen Sutcliffe were the authors of this booklet, and it's really a big recommendation for this booklet when you're interested in safety. They provoked and said there was not much success in patient safety over the last 20 years. Unfortunately, I must say, yes, they are right. Sure, we have the topic introduced in our discussions in our departments. We have this topic in our national societies and in international meetings, but the degree of implementation that safety should have in daily practice and in daily work in the hospital is definitely lacking. For example, the OECD, the International Organization for Economics, they published a paper accounting for the cost of patient safety. And they came up that in the countries of the Western world, almost 15% of the direct costs in hospitals belong to a problem of quality and safety.
Wow.
Nearly 15%
one
of
5%, 15%.
15%, 15%
Wow.
of direct costs in hospital. And imagine this huge amount of money.
Yeah.
But honestly, nobody is really dealing with this.
Yeah.
So when I talk to politicians in Switzerland, they talk a lot about all of insurance costs, and they talk about ambulization of patients, early discharge, and all these things. Nobody's talking about safety. When you imagine that we have this huge amount of money spent by quality and safety issues in our hospitals, I think that's one of the biggest problems, that nobody is really looking at this from a really systematic point of view. I think it was David Gabach who said, look what you're getting for when you spend money, because when we do not spend a lot of money for safety, that's what we are getting for. That's probably the reason. When we do not spend money for teaching, when we do not spend money for risk management and anesthesiology, there will not be a success. It is not mandatory in our hospitals, for example, to have team trainings, to have simulation trainings. Or take the other example, take electronic health record systems. They don't have an obligation to have a usability testing at all. And imagine a lack of usability testing in the cockpit. It's unbelievable. Nobody would fly in an airplane with an instrument that has not had a usability testing. But in our hospitals, we are working with electronic health record systems that did never had a usability testing. Yeah. So I think there is a lot of things we have to learn and improve in the future.
Yeah. And I feel like in the world of anesthesia, in the operating room, technology has advanced so much, and it is a complex system, but I think there's no denying that in the OR, safety has improved. But the perioperative care, I think, of the patient, I mean, when you think about, and we've had tons of discussions here and in other groups that I am involved in with talking about postoperative care. And, you know, I'm part of the APSF, the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation, and there's the Patient Safety Movement Foundation that talk a lot about postoperative care, where we still are having patients dying due to opioid overdose and inadequate monitoring. I don't know about you in Switzerland. In the US, many of us from Team Anesthesia do not know what happened to our patients after they leave us in the recovery room. So is there anything that you're doing really to try and address that?
That's absolutely right. One of the things that we must focus on in the future, I think, is also dealing with the postoperative phase. I absolutely agree with this, because when you look at the sheer number of morbidity and mortality, it is a huge amount that we are facing. And the level of safety is so much deteriorating when the patient is leaving the operating room and going to the general ward. And there is no difference in Switzerland, and I think it's no different in all over Europe. We have publications from the Netherlands. They say that we have 1 in 50 patients suffering from severe complications after surgery. 1 in 50. These are huge numbers, you know. I think we must focus on this aspect of the postoperative care. We do have monitoring devices that are now available on the wards. But again, these devices are important. They are nice, but they require that you have a workflow that they really can work. For example, when you have a patient on the ward and a monitoring device gives an alarm, the nurses on the ward must know what to do next. Yes. And whom to approach. And I think this is a problem, again, at least in my country, that a lot of activities, professional activities, go to personal optimization. So, for example, the surgeon is training very much on his or her technical capabilities, but the work on the ward is more and more getting lost between the disciplines. Yeah. Anesthesiology is not stepping in already. There are countries where the anesthesiologist is more and more stepping into the postoperative phase as the so-called perioperative physician. But it is a really tough topic because at the end of the day, it is about funding. And as long as the hospitals are not funding an anesthesiologist to work on the ward, it's very hard to cover the patients and to cover the works on the ward. And monitoring is only one, but we have now scoring systems available in the wards. But again, it's a question of who is responsible in the wards and what is the workflow in the wards. And this relates to this big topic of failure to rescue with these publications already, I think, more than 10 years ago. And I think this is still a big issue in patient safety.
Yeah, I had a conversation, a panel that I moderated again at the World Congress with some of the larger technology companies in industry. And one of the highlight, I feel like, of the conversation is that we can have technology, and the technology is now becoming available that can provide a lot of wonderful information and really kind of cut through the noise when there's the alarm fatigues and things like that. But I think going back to your original comment about the human factors piece of that, that's the next frontier for ensuring that the technology that we have is able to work, and that we have teams that either led by anesthesiologists or nurses or surgeons or hospitalists, as we have here in the US, we all need to work together to figure out how to best integrate those into our workflows and ensure that we're all, again, on the same page for all of that. And, also understanding that as team anesthesia, just because something happens on the ward doesn't mean that it's not our, I hate to say fault, but it's not something that we could have impacted. Again, if we don't know what happens and we kind of miss the mark, say on pain management, and then now they're having to take a bunch more narcotics, or they have an acute kidney injury, or they have some other cardiac issue that maybe we could have changed the way we did our care. So having all that to come back and work together, I think, is important.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In closing, where do you feel that the future of where we're going, like future state for you, what do you see is an optimal working situation where we can provide the safest care possible? And do you feel like there's anything we're right on the precipice of that can really change the face of patient safety for our patients?
I remember a book that I read a couple of years ago from the US. The title of the book was Why Hospitals Should Fly. Have you read this?
No.
Why Hospitals Should Fly. This is a wonderful book, and it's trying to incorporate all the knowledge of aviation industry into the hospitals. Or not simply looking on guidelines or checklist adherence, but looking on all the CRM principles, all the principles of good communication, coordination, good teamwork, a good spirit, a communication on an eye level between all the different disciplines, not looking at hierarchy or looking at specialty when you are integrating and interacting with each other. I think we still can learn a lot from other industries. We still can learn a lot from aviation, but also other industries. And I think that's the way we should go, because technology is already very fine. We spend a lot of money on perfect technology, but I think we should spend a little bit more on training, on simulation, on communication courses for our teams, and trying to work interdisciplinary, as I mentioned, together with surgeons, with trauma people, with obstetricians, with midwives, because that's our team that we are working every day and every night.
Yeah, that's right. Well, beautifully said, Sven. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to talking to you more about some of these other topics and really how we continue to promote creating a culture of safety and quality improvement is kind of what I've heard from you throughout the world, really, in our hospitals and how we manage perioperative care. So I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for being a guest here on TopMedTalk.
Thank you, Desiree, for this nice conversation. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you for listening to Top Med Talk. You know, you can always find us at topmedtalk.com. We are on social media. Hopefully this year in 2025, you're going to see us a whole lot more. We're kind of upping our game. So if you see something you like, you hear something that you like, please share with your colleagues, your teammates, wherever you are in the world. We appreciate that. Check us out on YouTube. We have all of our podcasts on YouTube as well. So if that's your primary listening channel, check us out there. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel. Every little bit helps to keep Top Med Talk free and open access to the world. And thank you to all of our sponsors, our platinum sponsors, GE Healthcare, Medtronic, Edwards Life Sciences, now known as BD. We appreciate the support again for keeping Top Med Talk available to all perioperative care providers around the world. So cheers, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.